How Play Chess, brought to you in association with Kagi.
Hello, my name is Svetlana and today we will be looking at round 8 of the Women's Candidates Tournament. This round there were two decisive games, and I want to show you the one between Humpy Koneru and Vaishali. Before this game, it seems like they have played each other twice before. Both of these games ended in a draw, including the one they played in round 1 of this exact tournament. But now, in the second half, there is even more at stake, so let's see how it turned out. Humpy Koneru, playing as white, started with d4 and Vaishali replied knight f6. Out of the opening, we are going to see the Grunfeld, which Vaishali has played many times before. Humpy seemed ready for it because she was the first to surprise her opponent with queen to b3. She has played many things against the Grunfeld before, but never this queen b3 move, as far as I could find. Usually, the main lines go with c takes d5, knight takes, e4, white gets a really strong center here, and the game goes on. These are the main lines of the Grunfeld. But in our game, we get this sideline with queen to b3. And essentially, what black has to do here is take, because that forces the queen to come to c4, and Vaishali has had this position once before, and in that game, she played bishop to e6, which is not the line that she went for here. Instead, she played bishop to g7, and after e4 castles, so far they have followed the main continuation of this sideline. Now, Humpy goes for a more rare move, bishop to f4, but this is part of the regular ideas, and it transposes to a lot of the typical lines with knight to f3 and to bishop to e2. But this bishop f4 attacks the pawn, so black has to defend it with c6. And after knight f3, bishop g4, just regular developments so far from both players. Now, Vaishali goes for knight f to d7. Looks a bit stranger than knight b to d7, but still, it's one of the main moves here, and it has some e5 ideas on the horizon. So far, we just see the development. Koneru also goes for rook to d1, and now knight to a6. So because that other knight took the d7 square, this knight needed to find a better place. I would think that white got a pretty comfortable position out of the opening. All of the pieces are on good squares. White has more central space, and at this point, Vaishali starts to think, takes a long think, and goes for some complications. So, as I've mentioned with the knight d7 moves, it seems like she was trying to play e5, and that's exactly what she does here. She takes on f3, bishop takes, and e5. It's a logical plan for this pawn structure, but white's pieces seem to be a bit more ready for opening of the center. So, this is a temporary pawn sacrifice. White takes this pawn, and after queen to e8, the pawn is attacked 3 times. So black will gain it back. But white decides to give it up in the other way, in the best possible way, and it is through e6, which also ruins black's pawn structure if they take it. So instead, Vaishali wanted to regain the pawn in a better way, and she went for knight to b6. Perhaps it was better to play queen to e6, and this is shown as the best line, but if you look at this endgame, I would think that this is a very unpleasant endgame down a pawn. Even if there is compensation, I understand why you wouldn't want to go for it. So instead, knight to b6, and now if white wants to take this pawn, they could be up a healthy extra pawn, but there's some counterplay for black. E-file, F-file is open, and the queen is still attacked. So, for example, after this, knight c5. There would be some compensation, but still an extra pawn for white. So, although it was possible to take that pawn with check, Koneru decided to just retreat the queen and to not allow black's pieces to gain activity. Now, Vaishali plays knight to c5, and this ends up being a pretty serious mistake. Instead, queen takes e6 was still best, going for this endgame where now black doesn't have to worry about that b7 pawn as much. But here, a very calm move like queen to c2 actually turns out to be best, and this is what Humpy plays in the game. The problem here with black's position is very subtle, but it becomes very clear after this queen to c2 retreat, and the main issue of black's position is this rook on f8. So no matter how you take the pawn for black, this rook is going to be a problem. If we take with the f-pawn, bishop to d6, attacking both the rook and the knight, there's no way to defend both of them at once. Same thing if the queen takes, bishop to d6. So in the game, she takes knight takes to e6. No matter what, black would have had to give up the exchange. And this is one of the ways. This was the result of this knight to c5 move earlier. Now bishop d6 and knight to d4. White doesn't get to take the rook immediately, but the rook is stuck. So for the next couple of moves, both players kind of ignored it and only took that rook when it was necessary. Bishop to e2, and now once black tries to free herself up, the rook is gladly taken with bishop to f8, and rook takes on f8. So this is a good moment to stop a bit and to judge the position. We see a healthy extra exchange for white. Black's pieces are working pretty well, but it is never enough to compensate for the material. Objectively, white should be winning, but we're at a point where both players have 20 minutes left, and there are still many pieces on the board. Anything can happen in such situations, which it did. At this point, white goes b3, just defending the c4 square for the bishop to come later. Black went a6, bishop to c4. As we see, white's pieces are also standing really well, dominating, and the extra exchange is still going to be felt. Everything was good for the next while. They were just trying to make moves quickly, avoiding trying to not get into too much time trouble. But now the first inaccuracy comes from Humpy, which gives away some of the advantage. She plays b4, which makes sense because maybe you get tired of this knight standing in the center being so well defended, so you want to remove one of the defenders of that knight, which is this pawn. But now Vaishali finds a great move that makes some problems for white on the queen side. She plays the best move, knight to a4. And now, as white takes this pawn and the queen takes, suddenly the position is not as dominating anymore. We see a set of important trades that follow. We get rook to c1 and black takes. The bishop takes back. If the queen takes back, this is possible as well, but then we get knight to c3, have to deal with all of that and the queen being attacked. So instead, bishop takes, queen takes, the pawn takes, and knight to c3. So here is where we get into the endgame. Actually, one of the first endgames that I'll show from the candidates tournament. Why is this not as good anymore? Well, white is still a healthy extra exchange up, but because she only has one pawn left on the queen side, this might create some problems, because if ever this pawn gets exchanged, for example, and the play gets shifted only to the other side of the board, only to one side, then it can be hard to win with a rook against, let's say, a knight, and you might not be able to have any passed pawns. Usually this is how these positions are won. You attack a pawn and then you win it, and then you get to promote. Plus, these doubled e-pawns might not be too helpful for white's case. But still, white is better, and white is going to be the one pushing for the win with the extra exchange. So, rook to c2, defending both the pawn and the bishop. Bishop to e5, rook d2. White needs to find a way to invade with the rooks and tries to invade on the 7th rank here. If knight to e4 here, then rook d7 is pretty strong, going to attack this pawn and potentially win this pawn in the future too. So instead, in the game, rook c8 happens. Bishop repositions itself to b3. Rook to c7 protects the 7th rank here, but it lets white invade on the 8th rank with rook to d8 check. King up, rook e8, so now this e4 pawn is finally protected. And this pawn might actually have a really good path here to e5 and to e6. So bishop to b3 happens in the game, bishop c5, and now was the point where white's slight inaccuracy has equalized the position. So she plays rook to f3, which looks completely normal to want to defend this pawn on e3, but white should have gone for something else instead. And that idea is e5. And it looks a bit unnatural because you would give up this pawn on e3 with check. The king goes to the corner. This is not what we want out of the endgame, to just keep the king in the corner there and not be able to come out. But if we look a bit deeper into this, after e6, this was not easy to find, but this gives white really good attacking chances. It allows the bishop to come into play, the two rooks to coordinate a bit better, and to create some problems for the black king. So this was the best way to keep up white's winning chances, but it's really hard to go for considering you have to give up a pawn with check. So instead, rook to f3, a5, and king to f1. Believe it or not, the position is now completely equal. As I said, it is never over while there are still pieces on the board, so both players are in time trouble now. We are nearing move 40. There's a few more moves that had to be played for both of them to relax a bit more and to actually be able to think about the position. And move 40 is now reached after rook a8 and bishop to d6. The position is still equal, but Vaishali really managed to get some counterplay here. Despite being this exchange down, her knight looks good, the bishop also is doing its job, so let's see how it went from here. White also has something to play for though. There's this permanent weakness on f7, which is important for both the two rooks and the bishop to attack. And we also need to really solve things on the queen side here where black potentially has a passed pawn. Rook to a6 followed, bishop e5 and g4. In endgames, it is usually good to occupy some more space if it's possible. But this move actually gives up a pawn on h2, and black was probably happy to take it. When you're down material, you're always happy to gain some of it back. The idea behind giving up this pawn was to play rook here and to actually attack this pawn on f7, which I said was going to be a big weakness for black. But this move essentially forces black to make a trade of this bishop, otherwise they cannot afford to give up the f7 pawn, so the knight gets traded and rook to b7. For now, the rook is going to be stuck to the 7th rank, protecting this pawn, but this rook is also doing a really important job of making this pawn go through. Now, white plays king to g2, attacking the bishop, and here in the game, Vaishali retreated the bishop, but there was a pretty funny line that could have happened here that started with b3. It looks very natural for black to also try to push and maybe even, get some winning chances if that pawn ever makes it to the end. And this line gives up the bishop on h2. And after b takes a2, white has to find the precise defense with rook f1 and rook b1. And now there's only one move to save this for white. The move is pretty crazy. It is g5, so we are threatening a mate now as white. Black can never really take this rook because then we're going to win with an extra rook and the pawn is not promoting anymore. And black also cannot promote to a queen because there is going to be mate with the two rooks here. Now the only move for black to defend would have been king to f8. And the reason why I'm showing this is that it's a pretty crazy line because there's only moves from each of the sides. Every single decision is an only move from white and for black to keep this equal. Otherwise, one of them is going to be lost. So the reason why this is equal is because white is going to have to go for some infinite checks now the only way to save it for black is to play king d8. And I don't know about you, I just found this line really, really wild, that there's an extra rook, but each of them have to keep up the equality and have to fight for it to be equal, but it's just going to be a draw in the end. So that it was not a possibility for black to actually get a passed pawn here, and to there were no winning chances with it if white defends correctly. But anyways, I just wanted to include this moment because it was an interesting bishop sacrifice, and I also wanted to include somewhere where you could guess the move by yourself, but these endgame lines were completely insane, and I just cannot do this to you. They're so complicated, and some of these only moves are just so difficult to guess. So in the actual game, Vaishali retreats bishop to e5, and now the rook has to move away. Rook a6. b3. So this passed pawn now makes a really important appearance. White has to play rook f1 to defend against the promotion, b2, rook b1, and here we are at the position that has shifted a little bit. If we think about the evaluation, once again, we would have to say that it's approximately equal, because even though white has this extra exchange, this bishop and the pawn definitely compensate for it. The pawn can't move, but also the rook cannot do anything and cannot even move from the first rank. So there's not really advantage for white in terms of the extra material, but there is slight advantage on the king side, because black's pawns also cannot move after this g5 move, which was good, which is why I said gaining space in endgames like this is actually a really important task. Here we are at a very tough spot because both players are in time trouble again. They have 1 to 2 minutes each, and we all know how complicated endgames are, especially when you have to make these decisions really quickly. In the game, we continued with rook to a7 check. The king moves away, e4, gaining space, which is what I really liked Humpy doing in this game. The pawns are now connected, so it looks at this point like Vaishali should have the draw in the bag with the bishop and the pawn against that rook that cannot move, but after all, this did not end up being enough. Humpy plays rook d3, and Vaishali makes a mistake with rook to c4, and this mistake will end up costing her the game. Instead, she should have played rook to b6 to protect against, to blockade this d6 spot a bit more. And even though we saw Vaishali make such a great comeback from having a lost position, being an exchange down, but she now blunders white's d6 idea with the pawn advance. But rook c8, there was a point to it, so she wanted to play rook to c1. And this is a great move because you want to this threatens the promotion very, very soon. And the problem with it is, there's only one problem with it, is that black misses this tactic with rook to b2. The bishop cannot take because of d7, and normally this would have been fine, but there is no way to defend against d8 queening. So the only problem with rook to c1 was this rook to b2 tactic, because the white's pawn was so advanced after the last d6 move. So it is very unfortunate, because once you see this pawn, you know that it becomes a problem and she has to defend against it. There's only one way to do it. It's with rook to c8. And after rook d5, she joins the second pawn onto e5. And this is winning for white now. It's only essentially one space forward that these pawns have advanced, which might not seem like a lot, but it is, because before then, the bishop was standing on e5 and really blocking them out. But now it's not, and these pawns are serious contenders to promote. She still tried to defend by bringing the king over, but the white king also now has more spots, and she plays very, very precisely here as white breaks this bishop and pawn fortress that black had going on by just attacking this bishop and forcing it to move away. The e5 pawn cannot be taken, so the bishop just retreats here, but rook to b2, the pawn is regained, and Humpy wins by resignation here. the passed pawns are just too strong, and now the other rook can also invade onto b8, let's say. So very long but instructive game by the two Indian players. Humpy got a winning position and was playing better in the middle game, as ended up winning the exchange, but Vaishali fought back all the way back to a drawn rook endgame, rook and bishop against two rooks. But oftentimes it is the time, the nerves, and the experience that really plays a decisive role in these matches.